Russia is calling on the U.S. to back its efforts to bring refugees back to Syria. Russia first proposed the plan after President Trump met with Putin last month. It includes creating new refugee centers and small-scale infrastructure within Syria. But analysts say the plan would put the U.S. at odds with allies demanding a political solution in Syria first. This comes days after the Wall Street Journal reported Syrian President Bashar Assad is using refugees as, quote, bargaining chips. The report cites Western diplomats who say the regime is using the situation of its people to secure foreign aid and sanction relief. For more on this, let's bring in Will Todman. He's an associate fellow for the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks for joining us, Will.
Thank you.
Well, what do we know about Russia's plan to return refugees to Syria?
So details of the plan started to emerge today, really, and Russian officials said, as you mentioned, that part of the plan will be to set up refugee centers in some of the neighboring countries that are hosting most of the refugees. So those are in Lebanon and Jordan. They also released some other details, such as saying that boats will be used to bring back refugees who are further afield. And they say that the U.S. agreed to the goals behind returning refugees at the Helsinki summit between President Putin and President Trump last month. But the U.S. has yet to formally comment on whether or not it's going to take part in these efforts.
Well, how is the Syrian regime allegedly using its displaced nationals as pawns on the international political stage?
Exactly. So the Syrian regime is very keen to link the return of refugees with gaining reconstruction funds. It's spent a lot of money on the conflict and has very little to spend on recovery in the country, and the amount that's required is going to be absolutely enormous. So they're now saying that they're ready to start accepting refugees again. The first refugees have been returning from Lebanon in the past few months, but they're saying that they need international support to do this. And in some ways, this is quite a clever move because previously the European Union and the United Nations has said very firmly that they're not prepared to take part in any financing of reconstruction efforts unless it's linked to a tangible political transition. And so now Russia and the Syrian regime are trying to bypass that and get the US to help contributing without committing to that political transition.
Well, if refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey were to return to Syria, what sort of conditions would they face?
They would face dire conditions. Obviously, the 7 years of conflict have wreaked havoc on Syria. Many cities have been largely destroyed, infrastructure has been destroyed, and for many, their homes no longer exist. And I think there's a real question about how many refugees actually want to return. The UN has said that fewer than 100,000 refugees out of more than 5 million have expressed any interest in returning. Russia counters this, saying the numbers are closer to 1 million. But refugee families I've spoken to in Lebanon certainly aren't keen to go back. They say the conditions they fled in the first place, the violence of the conflict and the violence of the Syrian regime, those conditions are still enduring. And so they say it's very much not, the conditions are not there for them to want to go back.
And is Bashar al-Assad's regime even capable of rebuilding the nation?
So certainly not. So as I said, the regime really has very little funds at the moment to spend on the scale of the reconstruction efforts that will be required. I think Russia also is unwilling and probably unable to commit the necessary funds. So this is why they're starting to turn to those countries that have consistently backed the Syrian opposition. And they're hoping now that the US has accepted that Bashar al-Assad is there to stay, and that it's time for them to accept that and to start contributing to the efforts. And the neighboring countries are very much backing that. Lebanon is really putting pressure on the international community and on the UN to support efforts to repatriate refugees. Over a quarter of Lebanon's population is now Syrian refugees, and the economic burden that they're experiencing is really quite extreme.
All right, Will Todman, thanks very much, Will.
Thank you.